Okay, I want to continue or finish the discussion of the Great Depression's effect on society, looking at various minority groups and their experience in the Great Depression. Next, I want to look at Asian Americans. And good news, they had great success during the Depression. Just kidding, not really. For Asian Americans, too, the Great Depression reinforced long-established patterns of discrimination and economic marginalization. When we're talking about Asian Americans in the 1930s, we're talking about really California, which had by far the largest Chinese and Japanese American populations. Even educated Asians found it difficult, however, if not impossible, to move into mainstream professions. Japanese, we have the Issei and the Nisei. I don't speak Japanese, but it's a take on their numbering system. The Issei are the first generation Japanese Americans. The Nisei are the second generation. And Nisei college grads often found themselves working at the family fruit stand. Japanese American farm workers and Chicanos, too, faced increased competition from the Midwest migrants, from the Okies. In California, the younger Nisei tried to challenge obstacles through politics by organizing something called Japanese American Democratic Clubs in several cities, which worked for, among other things, anti-discriminatory laws. So this is sort of the younger, more activist Japanese American approach. But at the same time, some Japanese American businessmen, some older men, tried to overcome obstacles by changing the Nisei themselves, by encouraging them to assimilate, to become more American. They formed the Japanese American Citizens League in 1930 to promote these goals. Chinese Americans fared no better. The overwhelming majority continued to work in Chinese-run laundries and restaurants, and those who ventured outside the Asian community never really rose above entry-level jobs. Even very educated Chinese, like physicians, could expect virtually no opportunities outside of Chinatowns. In that way, they were not unlike the small numbers of African American professionals. Let's turn our attention to women during the Great Depression. This is a pretty fascinating story. In many ways, the Great Depression strengthened the widespread belief that a woman's place was in the home, even though paradoxically that's not where they stayed in the Depression. Most men and many women believed scarce jobs, I want to say that again, most men and many women believed scarce jobs should go to unemployed men so they could have money to support their family. Men increasingly, however, relied on women because women were proportionally less unemployed than men. We'll get to why that is in a minute. And this exacerbated men's feelings of inadequacy. And this resentment created an anti-feminist masculine backlash against women. Many artists introduced a hyper-masculinism into their painting and sculpture. What am I talking about? Hyper-masculinism. Well, it's no coincidence that Superman debuted in 1938. He is a direct reflection of gender attitudes of the time. Superman's one weakness, aside from kryptonite, was his attraction to a mouthy working woman, Lois Lane, who presumably was employed, which meant one less man could be. But the widespread, and notice also here's some other WPA mural type work, and it shows strong, masculine men. This is kind of a reaction against women. The widespread assumption that married women should not work outside the home, however, did not stop them from doing so. Both single and married women worked in the 1930s, despite public condemnation, because they had to. In fact, by the end of the Great Depression, 20% more women were working than had been working before. This increase occurred despite these big societal obstacles I've mentioned. Professional opportunities declined because unemployed white men began moving into professions such as teaching and social work, which had previously been considered women's work. Female industrial workers were more likely to be laid off or get wage reductions than their male counterparts. But women had an advantage in that the non-professional jobs traditionally held by women were less likely to disappear. We see here two sets of occupations, male, quote-unquote, occupations and female occupations. And the percentage of unemployed in the male occupations was much greater. They were involved in manufacturing, and commodity production, and those things plummeted. The women did things like they worked as housekeepers, telephone operators, laundresses, things that were not as greatly impacted in the economic business cycle, and so they ended up with more women working than men. For American feminists, however, the Great Depression was a time of tremendous frustration. Although economic pressures pushed women into the workforce, those same pressures eroded the frail support that feminists had won in the 1920s for the idea of women becoming economically and professionally independent. The Great Depression saw the virtual extinction of the National Women's Party that fought throughout the 1920s for the ERA and other goals, the Equal Rights Amendment. And by the end of the 1930s, U.S. feminism had reached really its lowest ebb in nearly a century. Great Depression, its hardships placed great strains on families, as you might imagine. Middle-class families that had become accustomed in the 1920s to a constantly rising living standard were suddenly plunged into uncertainty. This provoked a profound anxiety. People clawed their way into this new middle class and had tremendous anxiety about remaining there. Some working-class families that had achieved a precarious prosperity in the 1920s saw those gains disappear. Most Americans were therefore forced to retreat from the consumer patterns they developed in the 20s. Women began sewing the family's clothes again, preserving food rather than buying things in stores. My parents are good examples of this. They had what's known as the Depression mindset because they grew up in that. Others engaged in little home businesses like taking in laundry, selling baked goods, taking in boarders. Many households expanded to take in their relatives. Despite this, though, the Great Depression eroded family units. There was a decline in the divorce rate, but largely because that was now too expensive for many. This also happened in the Great Recession. Over the last few years, there was a decline in the divorce rate, but only because couples delayed the divorce because they couldn't sell their house because of the housing bust. I personally have known some couples who lived in quiet hostility in the same house awaiting economic recovery. More common in the Depression was the informal breakup of families, particularly the desertion of families by unemployed men. They walked away to escape the humiliation of being unable to earn a living. Marriage and birth rates both declined simultaneously for the first time in the century.